One of those places where you don't have to worry about maintenance or being alone. Being alone, as if being alone was some terminal diagnosis, rather than a perfectly reasonable way to live. And where exactly would I go to build your grocery empire? There's this wonderful place called Sunset Manor, Jessica said, pulling out her phone to show me glossy photos. It has activities, meal plans, and medical staff on site. You'd have so much more social interaction. I looked at the photos of smiling seniors playing bingo and eating pureed vegetables in a sterile dining room. How thoughtful of you to research this without mentioning it to me first. The conversation had continued for another hour, with David and Jessica taking turns explaining why selling my home to fund their business venture was actually the best thing for everyone involved. I'd listened patiently, asked reasonable questions, and then driven home to my overwhelming house, where I'd spent the evening researching real estate investment opportunities. That conversation had been 3 weeks ago. Since then, they'd called daily with new reasons why I should liquidate my assets for their benefit. Yesterday's visit had been the final straw. David had arrived at my front door with a folder full of paperwork and the kind of determined expression he'd worn as a child when he wanted something expensive for Christmas. "Mom, we need to talk seriously about this." I'd let him in, made coffee, and listened as he laid out what he called the plan. They'd already found a buyer for my house, already toured 3 retirement communities, and already calculated how much money would be left over after purchasing my new living arrangement. The presumption was breathtaking. "You've been busy," I'd said, flipping through their carefully prepared documents. "Tell me, when exactly did I agree to any of this?" "Mom, be realistic. You're 67 years old. Dad's been gone 2 years. You're rattling around in this big house all by yourself. What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency? What if something happens and no one finds you for days?" The what-if game. Every adult child's favorite way to convince themselves they know what's best for their parents. "David, honey, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about where and how I live." His jaw had tightened. "Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you're being stubborn and unreasonable. Jessica's business could change our lives, could secure our children's future, and you're standing in the way of that because you're too attached to material things." Too attached to material things. My home, where I'd celebrated every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone for 25 years, was just a material thing. "And if I don't want to sell, then you're being selfish." Jessica has worked for 2 years developing this app. She's incredibly talented. "Mom, this isn't some pipe dream." She has investors interested, but they want to see that we have some skin in the game, some real commitment with my money. "I see. And if I choose not to invest in Jessica's venture?" David had leaned back in his chair, and for a moment, I'd seen a flash of something cold in his eyes, something that reminded me uncomfortably of his teenage years when he didn't get his way. "Then I guess we'll have to agree to disagree. But I can't pretend to support decisions that seem designed to hurt our family's future." That's when Jessica had arrived, letting herself in without knocking, like she owned the place. Maybe she was already counting on it. "Hi, Mom, Margaret. How's our favorite soon-to-be entrepreneur?" She'd kissed my cheek with the enthusiasm of someone who'd already spent my money in her head. I'd smiled back just as brightly. "Actually, I've been thinking about your proposal." Their faces had lit up like Christmas morning, and David prompted, "And I've decided against it." The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica's smile froze on her face. David's coffee cup hit the saucer with a sharp clink. "I don't understand," Jessica said slowly. "Against what exactly?" "Against selling my house. Against moving to a retirement community. Against funding your business venture. Against all of it, really." I'd kept my voice pleasant, conversational, as if I was declining an invitation to a potluck rather than dismantling their financial dreams. That's when David had stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is ridiculous, Mom. Ridiculous," I'd repeated, tilting my head like I was genuinely curious. "Which part exactly? The part where I choose to keep living in my own home, or the part where I declined to liquidate my assets to fund your wife's business?" Jessica's cheeks had flushed red. "Mom, Margaret, I think you're misunderstanding the opportunity here. This isn't just about us. This is about securing everyone's future. Your grandchildren's college funds, our retirement, your own long-term care needs. Long-term care needs. Funny how those needs somehow required me giving them my money now rather than keeping it for, my actual long-term care. I appreciate the concern, but I have my own financial planning well in hand. Do you? David's voice had an edge now because Dad always handled the money, didn't he? And you've never had to make these kinds of big financial decisions on your own. There it was. The assumption that because Frank had enjoyed managing our investments, I was somehow financially illiterate. Never mind that I'd been the one tracking every expense, balancing every checkbook, and negotiating every major purchase for 4 decades. Never mind that I had a master's degree in education and had managed school budgets for 15 years before retiring. You're right, I said, nodding thoughtfully. I've never had to make big financial decisions on my own. I guess we'll find out how capable I really am. David had run his hands through his hair in frustration. This isn't a game, Mom. This is our lives, our future. Jessica has been working on this app for 2 years. She's put everything into it, and I've put everything into this house for 25 years. Seems like we're both pretty invested in our respective ventures. Jessica had tried a different approach. What if we structured it as a loan? You could sell the house, move somewhere more manageable, and loan us the money for the business. When we start turning a profit, we'll pay you back with interest. A loan. How generous of them to offer to pay me back my own money. What kind of collateral would you be putting up for this loan? They'd exchanged another look. Well, the business itself would be collateral. A business that doesn't exist yet based on an app that isn't finished in a market that's already saturated with grocery delivery services. I'd smiled. I think I'll pass. That's when David had lost it completely. His face went red, his voice rose, and he'd started pacing around my living room like a caged animal. You know what your problem is, Mom. You're too old and too set in your ways to understand how the modern world works. You don't understand technology. You don't understand business, and you sure as hell don't understand money. I'd felt something cold settle in my chest. Is that so? Yes, that's so. You're living in the past, clinging to things that don't matter anymore. And you're too stubborn to see that we're trying to help you. We're trying to take care of you, and you're fighting us every step of the way. Jessica had placed a restraining hand on his arm. David, honey, maybe we should. No, he'd snapped. She needs to hear this. Mom, you're too old and dumb to understand money, so you're not welcome in this house until you change your mind. And that's when I'd smiled sweetly, stood up, and walked toward the door. Because David had just given me the perfect motivation to show him exactly how well this old dumb woman understood money. I spent that evening researching David and Jessica's current living situation. Amazing what you can find online these days. They rented a 2-bedroom apartment in the trendy Riverside district for $3,500 a month. The building was called Harbor View Apartments, built in 2018 with all the modern amenities young professionals loved. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, and a rooftop fitness center. I also discovered that Harborview Apartments was owned by Riverside Properties LLC, which was owned by an investment group based in Chicago. Corporate ownership meant the building changed hands relatively frequently, and corporate ownership also meant they were usually willing to sell to the right buyer for the right price. Monday morning, I called my financial advisor, Robert Chen, and scheduled an emergency meeting. Robert had been managing my investments since Frank's death, and he was one of the few people who truly understood my financial position. When Frank died, his life insurance combined with our savings and investments had left me with just over $2 million in assets. Not wealthy by some standards, but more than enough to live comfortably and, if necessary, make some interesting real estate investments. Margaret, Robert said, settling into his desk chair. You sounded urgent on the phone. Is everything all right? Everything's fine, Robert. I need to liquidate some assets and make a rather large purchase. He'd pulled up my accounts on his computer. What kind of purchase are you thinking about? Downsizing the house. Actually, I'm thinking about buying an apartment building. Robert's fingers had paused over his keyboard. I'm sorry, what? Harborview Apartments in the Riverside district. I want to know if it's for sale, and if it is, whether I can afford it. Margaret, that's a pretty significant departure from your usual investment strategy. Can I ask what's prompting this sudden interest in real estate? I'd smiled. Let's call it a family investment. It took Robert 3 days to get back to me with information. Harborview Apartments was indeed for sale. The Chicago Investment Group was looking to liquidate several smaller properties to fund a larger commercial development project. The asking price was $3.2 million. But Robert thought we could probably negotiate them down to $2.8 million. Especially if I could close quickly with cash. The numbers work, he'd explained, spreading printouts across his desk. The building has 18 units, currently at 94% occupancy. The rental income would more than cover your expenses and property management costs, with enough left over to provide you with a steady income stream. What about financing? Well, that's the interesting part. You could put down about $800,000 and finance the rest, which would preserve most of your liquid assets. Or you could buy it outright with cash, which would give you tremendous negotiating power and eliminate any financing complications. I thought about David's words, too old and dumb to understand money. Let's go with cash. Robert had stared at me for a long moment. Margaret, that would leave you with very little in liquid savings. Are you absolutely certain about this? I'm certain. Can I ask why this particular building? I smiled again. My son and daughter-in-law live there. I thought it might be nice to be their landlord. The look on Robert's face had been priceless. Oh my. The negotiations took 2 weeks. The Chicago group was motivated to sell, especially when I came in with a cash offer and a 30-day closing timeline. We settled on $2.7 million, which left me with about $300,000 in liquid assets, plus my house and the rental income from 18 apartment units. I didn't tell David and Jessica what I was doing. In fact, I didn't speak to either of them at all during those 2 weeks. When David called, I let it go to voicemail. When Jessica stopped by, I pretended not to be home. I wanted the sale to be complete and legally binding before they had any idea what was happening. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Robert's office. I wore my best navy blue suit, the one I'd bought for Frank's funeral, and carried a leather portfolio that had belonged to my father. If I was going to become a real estate investor, I figured I should look the part. Congratulations, Mrs. Sullivan, the title company representative said, handing me a thick folder of documents. You are now the proud owner of Harborview Apartments. I'd shaken hands with everyone in the room, signed what felt like 100 pieces of paper, and walked out the owner of the building where my ungrateful son and his ambitious wife paid $3,500 a month in rent. That afternoon, I called the property management company that had been handling the building for the previous owners. This is Margaret Sullivan, the new owner of Harborview Apartments. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss some changes to the rental agreements. The property manager, a pleasant woman named Carol Henderson, met me at the building the next morning. She gave me a tour of the common areas, explained the current lease terms, and reviewed the tenant files with me. Harborview was well maintained and profitable, with a waiting list of potential renters. Most of our current leases are up for renewal within the next 6 months, Carol explained as we sat in the building's small management office. Standard practice is to increase rents by about 3 to 5% annually to keep up with market rates. What about larger increases? I asked. What if the market supports significantly higher rents? Carol had consulted her tablet. Well, the law allows rent increases up to 10% without additional justification. Anything higher than that requires documentation that the increase reflects fair market value. But this area has been gentrifying rapidly. Comparable units in newer buildings are renting for $4,000 to $4,500 a month. I'd done some quick math and, my head, David and Jessica's current rent was $3,500. A rent increase to $4,500 would represent nearly a 30% increase, but it would also bring their unit in line with market rates. I'd like to review the lease for Unit 4B specifically, I said. Carol had pulled up the file. Carol had pulled up David and Jessica Sullivan. They've been excellent tenants. Always pay on time. No complaints from neighbors. Their lease is up for renewal in 6 weeks. Perfect, I said. I think it's time they learned about market rates. I spent the next few weeks learning everything I could about being a landlord. I read books about property management, researched tenant rights and landlord responsibilities, and studied the rental market in the Riverside district. I wanted to make sure that when I raised David and Jessica's rent, I was doing it legally and appropriately. I also had Carol conduct a professional market analysis of Unit 4B. The analysis confirmed that comparable units in the area were indeed renting for $4,000 to $4,500 per month. David and Jessica had been getting a bargain at $3,500, probably because the previous owners hadn't kept up with market rates. 3 weeks after I bought the building, I got a call from Jessica. Mom, Margaret. Her voice was tight with barely controlled frustration. We need to talk. David is being stubborn about calling you, but this has gone on long enough. Has it? I asked, settling into my favorite chair with a cup of tea. What exactly has gone on long enough? This silent treatment, this whatever this is you're doing. We understand you're upset about our conversation, but you're being childish. Childish, that was rich. Coming from a woman who'd spent months pressuring me to sell my home to fund her business venture. I'm not upset, dear. I've been busy. Busy with what? Investment opportunities. It turns out I understand money better than anyone thought. There was a pause. What kind of investment opportunities? Real estate, primarily. I've discovered I have quite a knack for it. Mom, Margaret, if this is some kind of passive-aggressive way to make a point about our business proposal. Oh no, dear. I've moved on from your business proposal entirely. I'm focused on my own ventures now. Jessica had sighed dramatically. Look, we're willing to compromise. What if we found a different way to fund the startup? What if we took out a business loan instead of asking you to sell the house? That sounds like an excellent plan, I'd said cheerfully. I'm sure the bank will be very interested in your app concept, but we'd still like your support. Your emotional support, I mean. It would mean a lot to know that you believe in what we're trying to build. Emotional support, free of charge, naturally. I'll certainly consider that, Jessica. In the meantime, I should probably mention that I've become your landlord. Another pause, longer this time. I'm sorry. What? I bought your building, Harborview Apartments. Closed on it last Tuesday. Lovely property, really. Excellent investment potential. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You bought our building. I did indeed. And Carol from the property management company will be contacting you soon about your lease renewal. It seems your rent has been quite below market rate. We'll be adjusting it to reflect current property values. How much? Jessica's voice was strained. Well, comparable units in the area are renting for around $4,500 a month. Your current lease expires in 3 weeks, so the new rate would take effect at the beginning of next month. I heard Jessica take a sharp breath. That's nearly a $1,000 increase. $950 to be precise. Though really, Jessica, I thought you and David understood money better than that. After all, I'm just a silly old woman who's too dumb to understand these things. But that conversation had revealed something interesting. When Jessica panicked about the rent increase, she'd said something that stuck with me. We can't afford that right now. Not with everything else we have going on. Everything else they had going on. That phrase had been nagging at me for days. I was starting to suspect there was more to David and Jessica's financial situation than I'd realized. That's when I decided it was time to do a little more research into my son's life. I started my investigation the old-fashioned way, by paying attention. For the past 2 years, every time David and Jessica visited, I'd noticed little things. Jessica's designer handbags that cost more than most people's monthly rent. David's new BMW, the one he'd claimed was necessary for work, but couldn't quite explain how a middle school math teacher needed luxury transportation. The expensive dinners, the weekend trips to wine country, the constant talk about investments and opportunities. Now that I thought about it, they'd been living well above their means for quite some time. I called my neighbor Patricia, who worked as a loan officer at First National Bank. Patricia had helped me refinance my house 3 years ago, and we'd stayed friendly since then. More importantly, Patricia knew everyone's business in our small city. Margaret, how lovely to hear from you, Patricia said when I reached her at work. How are you holding up? I heard David and Jessica have been spending a lot of time over there lately. Actually, Patricia, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I'm curious about something, and I'm hoping you might have some insight. Hypothetically speaking, if someone was living significantly beyond their income, what would that look like from a banker's perspective? Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's an interesting hypothetical question. Are we talking about someone specific? We might be, well, hypothetically, someone living beyond their means might have multiple credit cards with high balances. Maybe a car loan that's more than they can reasonably afford. Possibly a second mortgage or home equity line of credit. They might be making minimum payments on everything while maintaining an expensive lifestyle. That sounded uncomfortably familiar. And if this hypothetical person suddenly found themselves needing a large sum of money quickly, they'd be in trouble. Banks don't like to lend to people who are already overextended. They'd probably need either significant collateral or a cosigner with excellent credit and substantial assets. A cosigner like a widowed mother with a paid-off house and $2 million in investments. I'd been so naive. Patricia, one more hypothetical question. If someone defaulted on their debts, what would happen? Depending on the amount, it could be anything from damaged credit to wage garnishment to bankruptcy. Why, do you ask? Just curious about how the world works these days. Thank you, Patricia. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the garden Frank and I had planted together. The roses were blooming beautifully, completely unaware that their peaceful existence was about to be disrupted by my growing understanding of my son's financial situation. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. Her name was Sandra Mills, and she came highly recommended by Robert's law firm. Sandra was a former police detective who specialized in financial investigations. Mrs. Sullivan, Sandra said, settling into my living room with a notepad and her phone. Can you tell me exactly what you'd like me to find out? I want to know everything about my son David and daughter-in-law, Jessica's financial situation, income, debts, spending habits, everything. I have reason to believe they're in serious financial trouble, and I need to understand exactly how serious. Sandra had taken notes while I explained the situation. This sounds like it might be a case of elder financial abuse. Mrs. Sullivan, have they asked you for money directly? They've asked me to sell my house to fund Jessica's business venture. They've been quite persistent about it. And you declined. I did more than decline. I bought their apartment building and tripled their rent. Sandra had paused in her note-taking to look at me with what I could only describe as admiration. Well, that's certainly one way to handle the situation. How long do you need this information? As soon as possible. Their lease renewal is due in 2 weeks, and I have a feeling their financial situation is about to become very relevant. Sandra had promised to have preliminary information within a week. I'd written her a check for her retainer and shown her out, then spent the rest of the afternoon researching everything I could find about Jessica's app. Business online. What I found was interesting. Jessica had been posting about her revolutionary grocery delivery app on social media for almost 2 years. She'd attended entrepreneur conferences, participated in networking events, and talked constantly about seeking investors. But there was no actual evidence of a functioning business. No website, no app in development, no business registration that I could find. It was starting to look like Jessica's grand business venture was nothing more than an expensive hobby funded by credit cards and dreams. David showed up at my door Thursday evening, unannounced and clearly agitated. I was in my garden, deadheading roses and enjoying the evening breeze when I heard his car door slam in my driveway. "Mom, we need to talk," he called out, marching across my lawn like he was leading a military charge. "Good evening to you, too, sweetheart," I said, not looking up from my roses. "Lovely evening, isn't it?" "Cut the act, Mom. I know what you're doing." I straightened up and looked at him, really looked at him. David's hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. This wasn't the confident man who'd strutted around my living room 3 weeks ago telling me I was too old and dumb to understand money. What act would that be? Buying our building, raising our rent, this whole passive-aggressive revenge thing you've got going on. Revenge? I pulled off my gardening gloves and gave him my full attention. "David, I made a sound real estate investment. The fact that you and Jessica happen to live in the building is simply a coincidence." His voice was loud enough that Mrs. Henderson next door peered over the fence with obvious interest. "You did this to punish us for asking you to sell the house." "I did this because I realized you were right about one thing. I do need to be more actively involved in managing my finances. So, I diversified my investment portfolio with some real estate. Isn't that what modern, financially savvy people do?" David ran his hands through his hair. "Mom, you don't understand. We can't afford a $900 rent increase right now." "Why not? You make $65,000 a year teaching. Jessica makes well. What does Jessica make from her business ventures?" The question hung in the air between us. David's face went pale, and he looked away. "It's complicated. I'm sure it is. But surely between your stable teaching income and Jessica's entrepreneurial success, you can manage market rate rent on a 2-bedroom apartment. The business isn't profitable yet. Jessica's still in the development phase. After 2 years, these things take time. I studied my son's face, noting the way he couldn't meet my eyes, the defensive set of his shoulders. David, how much debt are you carrying? That's none of your business. It became my business when you asked me to sell my house to solve your financial problems. It became my business when you called me too old and dumb to understand money. So I'll ask again, how much debt? David sank onto my porch steps, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. About $80,000. Credit cards mostly. Jessica's business expenses. The car loan, $80,000. No wonder they'd been so desperate for me to sell my house. And your monthly income covers how much of your minimum payments? Not enough. His voice was barely a whisper. We've been using credit cards to pay credit cards for the past 6 months. Jessica keeps saying she's on the verge of a breakthrough with investors, but there are no investors. David looked up sharply. What makes you say that? Because I did some research, sweetheart. Jessica's been talking about this app for 2 years, but there's no evidence it actually exists. No business registration, no website, no prototype, nothing. That's not true. She's been working incredibly hard. On what exactly? David, have you ever seen this app she's developing? Have you seen any code, any business plan, any actual evidence that it exists outside of Jessica's imagination? The silence stretched between us. David stared at his hands, and I could see the exact moment he admitted to himself what he'd probably suspected for months. She keeps saying she needs the right equipment, the right software, the right connections, he said. Finally, everything costs money. And she says once she has the right resources, she'll be able to demonstrate the concept to investors. Poor David, he'd been married to Jessica for 8 years, and he still didn't understand that he was married to a dreamer, not an entrepreneur. Honey, I think it's time you faced the reality of your situation. The next morning, Sandra Mills called with her preliminary report. What she'd found confirmed my worst suspicions and added a few new wrinkles I hadn't expected. Mrs. Sullivan, your son and daughter-in-law, are in serious financial trouble, Sandra said without preamble. David's telling the truth about the $80,000 in credit card debt, but that's just the beginning. Jessica has been using his excellent credit to open new accounts, and she's been moving money between cards to avoid default notices. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. How bad is it? They're currently carrying debt on 17 different credit cards. The minimum monthly payments total about $3,000, which is more than half of David's take-home pay. They've also got a car loan for $48,000 on that BMW, plus their rent and living expenses. 17 credit cards. Jessica's been very creative. She's been opening new cards in David's name, using promotional balance transfer offers to shuffle debt around and taking cash advances to make minimum payments on other cards. It's a house of cards that's about to collapse. I closed my eyes. How long before it all falls apart without a significant injection of cash? Probably 2 to 3 months. Maybe less if any of the credit card companies decide to accelerate their payment schedules, and this app business. Sandra's laugh was grim. Mrs. Sullivan, I couldn't find any evidence that Jessica has ever written a single line of code. She's been attending networking events and entrepreneur meets, talking a big game about her revolutionary app, but there's no business entity, no intellectual property filings, no software development contracts, nothing, as far as I can tell. She's been using business expenses as an excuse to fund a lifestyle she can't afford. The picture was becoming crystal clear. Jessica had convinced David that she was building a business empire while actually building a debt empire. And when the walls started closing in, they turned to the most obvious source of quick cash, David's widowed mother, with her paid-off house and substantial savings. There's one more thing, Sandra continued. I found records of Jessica attending something called Entrepreneur Success Seminars. These are essentially get-rich-quick schemes that prey on people with big dreams and limited business experience. She spent almost $15,000 on various courses, coaching programs, and motivational seminars over the past 2 years. $15,000 on seminars about how to become successful while accumulating $80,000 in debt. The irony was almost too painful to contemplate. Thank you, Sandra. Please send me your full report when it's ready. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone and thinking about my son. David wasn't a bad person. He was a good teacher who genuinely cared about his students. He'd been a loving father to his children before his divorce 5 years ago. But he'd also always been susceptible to confident people who promised him easy solutions to complex problems. First, his ex-wife, who'd convinced him that their marriage would be perfect if only he'd changed everything about himself. Now, Jessica, who'd convinced him that financial security was just one revolutionary app away. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. Mom, Margaret. Jessica's voice was bright and cheerful, as if nothing had changed between us. I was wondering if you might be free for lunch today. I have some exciting news about the business, and I'd love to share it with you. Exciting news. I almost laughed. I'd be delighted, dear. Where shall we meet? How about that cute little cafe downtown, Rosemary's Bistro, noon. Perfect. I'll see you there. After hanging up, I smiled for the first time in days. It was time to find out exactly what kind of exciting news Jessica had to share, and it was time to let her know that her future landlord was very interested in her business ventures. Rosemary's Bistro was crowded with the lunch crowd when I arrived at noon. Jessica was already seated at a corner table, looking radiant in a new silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. She waved enthusiastically when she spotted me, like we were old friends meeting for a casual chat rather than a desperate woman about to pitch her last-ditch scheme to her Mark. Mom, Margaret, you look wonderful, Jessica gushed as I sat down. I ordered you the salmon salad. I know how much you love their salmon. How thoughtful. I settled into my chair and smiled. You mentioned exciting news about your business. Jessica's eyes lit up with the fervor of a true believer. Yes, and I'm so glad you're here to share this moment with me, Margaret. I've been selected to participate in Techstart Accelerator's Elite Entrepreneur Program. How wonderful. What does that involve? It's a 6-month intensive program where established successful entrepreneurs mentor promising startups. They provide workspace, technical support, marketing guidance, everything a business needs to go from concept to market. She pulled out her phone and showed me a glossy website featuring smiling young people in modern office spaces. The program has a 93% success rate for launching profitable businesses. Companies that go through Techstart typically see initial investments of $500,000 to $2 million within the first year. I studied the website carefully. And what does this program cost? Jessica's smile faltered slightly. Well, it's not exactly free. The program fee is $45,000, but when you consider the potential return on investment, $45,000, I had to admire Jessica's commitment to her delusions. Even facing financial ruin, she was still chasing expensive dreams. That's quite a substantial fee, but it's an investment, not an expense. Margaret, this is the break I've been working toward for 2 years. This program will give me everything I need to launch successfully, and you have $45,000 to pay for this program. Jessica's confident facade cracked just a little. That's actually why I wanted to have lunch with you today. I know our last conversation didn't go well, and I know you've made some decisions about your living situation that we might not have initially understood. Ah, there it was. The real reason for this lunch meeting. Go on. I was hoping that maybe seeing this incredible opportunity, you might reconsider your position on supporting the business. Not the whole house selling plan, obviously, but maybe a smaller investment, just enough to cover the program fee. I sipped my iced tea and considered my response. Sandra's investigation had revealed that Techstart Accelerator was one of those entrepreneurs coaching companies that charge desperate people enormous fees for services they could get for free at any small business development center. Their 93% success rate was based on their definition of success, which apparently included anyone who managed to create a business entity, regardless of whether it ever made a dollar in profit. $45,000 is indeed a smaller amount than selling my house, I said thoughtfully. But it's still a significant sum. Of course it is, and I wouldn't ask if this wasn't such an incredible opportunity. Margaret, I know David said some things he shouldn't have said. He was frustrated about our financial situation, and he took it out on you. That was wrong. What financial situation would that be? Jessica's spoon clinked against her soup bowl. Oh, the usual challenges young couples face. Student loans, the mortgage. She trailed off, apparently remembering that she rented an apartment, not owned a home. The mortgage on what exactly? I meant rent. You know what I mean. I leaned forward slightly. Jessica, I know about the 17 credit cards. The color drained from Jessica's face. I don't know what you're talking about. I know about the $80,000 in debt. I know about the cash advances and balance transfers. I know about the $15,000 you've spent on entrepreneur seminars. And I know that this revolutionary app you've been developing for 2 years doesn't actually exist. Jessica sat frozen, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Around us, the normal sounds of the restaurant continued. Conversations, clinking silverware, the espresso machine hissing. But our corner table had become an island of tense silence. Margaret, I can explain. I'm sure you can. You're very good at explaining things. Jessica, you explained why I should sell my house. You explained why David and I were too old-fashioned to understand modern business. You explained why your app was going to revolutionize the grocery industry. The problem is, none of your explanations were true. Jessica's hands were shaking now. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. David's job barely covers our basic expenses. I've been trying so hard to build something to create a future for us by destroying your present. Jessica, you've convinced my son to accumulate enough debt to buy a house, all in service of a business that exists only in your imagination. The business is real, Jessica insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. I just need the right resources to make it happen. No, dear, you need the right reality check to make it stop. Jessica stared at me across the table, and I watched as the last of her pretenses finally crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, her perfect posture collapsed, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked like what she actually was, a scared, overwhelmed woman who'd gotten in way over her head. I don't know how to stop, she whispered. It started small, just a few thousand on credit cards to attend some business seminars. But then I met all these successful entrepreneurs, and they made it sound so easy. They said if I just had the right tools, the right connections, the right program, I could build something amazing. And each program cost more money. They all promised they were the last investment I'd need to make. Each seminar led to another opportunity, another chance to learn from someone who'd already succeeded. Before I knew it, I was in so deep that I had to keep going forward because I couldn't afford to go back. I felt a familiar mix of frustration and sympathy. Jessica wasn't evil, just foolish and desperately unwilling to face reality. And when did David find out how bad things had gotten? He doesn't know everything, Jessica admitted. He knows about some of the cards, but not all of them. He thinks the debt is around 40,000, not 80. I've been managing the payments, shuffling things around to keep us current, until now. Until now, she agreed miserably. Margaret, I know I've made mistakes, huge mistakes, but if I could just get this one last program, if I could just prove that the business model works. Jessica, I reached across the table and took her hand. Stop, just stop. There is no business model, there is no app, there is no revolutionary anything. There's just a young woman who got seduced by the promise of easy money and convinced herself that the next expensive program would be the magic solution. Tears started streaming down Jessica's face. But if there's no business, then what do I do? How do I explain this to David? How do we get out of this mess? The same way people have always gotten out of debt, by facing reality, making a plan, and doing the hard work of climbing out of the hole you've dug. We can't afford the new rent, Jessica said quietly. Even if we stopped everything else, stopped all the business expenses, we can't afford $4,500 a month. I know. So, what happens now? Do you evict us? Do we have to declare bankruptcy? I looked at this young woman who'd spent 2 years trying to manipulate me into funding her fantasies, and I made a decision that surprised even me. Here's what's going to happen. You and David are going to move into my guest bedroom. Jessica's head snapped up. What? You're going to live in my house rent-free for 1 year. During that time, David will keep teaching, and you will get a real job. Not entrepreneur networking, not app development, a real job with a steady paycheck. Every penny you earn above basic living expenses will go toward paying down your debt. I don't understand. Why would you help us after everything we've done? Because David is my son, and despite his poor judgment in marriage partners, I love him. And because you, Jessica, are going to learn what it actually means to work for money, instead of constantly scheming to get it without effort. Jessica was crying harder now. What about your privacy, your independence? We can't just move into your house. Oh, there will be conditions, I said, signaling the waitress for our check. Many conditions. You'll follow my house rules, contribute to household chores, and attend weekly financial counseling sessions. You'll also surrender all credit cards to me for safekeeping and live on a strict cash budget that I'll help you create. And if we refuse, I smiled, then you'll pay market rate rent on your apartment until you're evicted for non-payment, at which point you'll be homeless with destroyed credit and no family support. Your choice. We sat in silence while I paid the check. Finally, Jessica looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. Why are you doing this? Because 3 weeks ago, my son told me I was too old and dumb to understand money. Well, Jessica, I understand money just fine. I understand that it's a tool, not a goal. I understand that real wealth comes from living within your means, not above them. And I understand that sometimes the most valuable lesson you can teach someone is that actions have consequences. I stood up and gathered my purse. David was right about one thing, though. I am old. Too old to waste time on grudges and hurt feelings. Too old to watch my son destroy his life because he married someone who confused confidence with competence. What about your apartment building? Oh, I'm keeping that. It's an excellent investment, but I'll find you nice, responsible tenants who can actually afford the rent. As we walked out of the restaurant together, Jessica asked, what if David doesn't want to accept your help? I thought about my stubborn, proud son, who'd inherited his father's teaching heart and his mother's financial sense. Even if he'd temporarily misplaced both, he'll learn that pride is an expensive luxury he can no longer afford. 6 months later, David and Jessica were living in my guest room. Jessica was working as a customer service representative at the local utility company, and their debt was down to $47,000. Jessica had discovered that she was actually quite good at solving problems for frustrated customers, and David had started teaching evening math tutoring sessions for extra income. They weren't happy about their circumstances, but they were learning the difference between earning money and borrowing dreams. And me, I was enjoying my new role as a landlord, my monthly rental income, and the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best way to help someone is to refuse to enable them. The old Margaret might have written Jessica a check for $45,000 and watched her son's marriage collapse under the weight of magical thinking. The new Margaret had learned that real love sometimes requires saying no, even when it's harder than saying yes, especially when it's harder than saying yes. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.